I hope the global conference has been keeping everyone busy and that you're finding the conversation stimulating and worthwhile. And if so, then we'll try our best to keep up to the high standards set by many of the other panels. My name is Wing, Chan Hing Wing. I'm from Singapore and I'm part of the newest unit of the Milken Institute, which is the Asia Center, which has just been set in Singapore. We are going to hold the Singapore Summit in, an Asia Summit in Singapore in September this year. And if you are in the region, we would really love to welcome you to join us in Singapore in September. Well, this morning we're going to talk about China's economic outlook, the view from Asia. I thought I'd just start by saying that it's really difficult to imagine that when Jimmy Carter was the president of the United States, people in China couldn't buy rice, oil, or even cloth to make clothes without getting a coupon from the government, because these were all rationed items, and they were such rare commodities. Our panelist, Virginia Kamsky, Ginny was there that time. She must have been about 3 years old, I think.
Thank you.
But Ginny, in fact, has a hukou registration. A hukou is a household registration, which is really quite rare for a non-Chinese to have. In fact, it is so rare that today it's one of the big issues in China, because many of the immigrant laborers from outside of the city that they are working in do not have this hukou registration. And as a result of which, many of them have no access to facilities like education for their children or access to hospitals. So Ginny having a hukou you're very special.
A Beijing hukou.
A Beijing hukou to boot. It must be worth a lot of money, except it's not tradable. Well, the rags to riches story in China for some, and I would emphasize for some, as well as the capacity to develop the country at such a rapid rate from what it was then to what it is today, must be really one of the real stories of the 20th and even the 21st century. And yet today, the world looks on anxiously to see what dangers this fast growth portends. Once we used to say that if America sneezes, the world catches a cold. Well, I think the same thing is being said about China today. Certainly for us in Asia, we will feel the very cold winds if they start sneezing. Well, we have this morning 3 people who may not live permanently in China, but spend as much time there as anyone else. Dr. Ha Jiming is now the Goldman Sachs Vice Chairman and Chief Investment Strategist in the China Investment Division of Goldman's. Jiming was once the Chief Economist of CICC. Now, this is the only Chinese investment bank in the world. We have Virginia Kamsky. Ginny has lived both in Beijing and New York for more than 30 years and runs a strategic advisory firm in Beijing. And finally, Huang Jing, who is the head of the Center on Asia and Globalization in the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. He writes extensively on politics in China. I thought what we'd do is that we'll give the panelists some questions first, but at the end of each question, I would invite your comments and questions so that we have a much more interactive session this morning. So perhaps I will start with the first question, which is that in China, we always talk about whether it's going to have a hard or a soft landing. But all countries go through periods of growth, sometimes very high growth, and then falling back. Indeed, Japan has been falling back for almost 20 years. And yet, why do economists and business people concern themselves with whether there is a hard or soft landing in China? And Jiming, perhaps you could start by addressing this. What is the real impact on people's lives in China, whether there is a hard or a soft landing?
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, I think there's no unique definition of hard landing versus soft landing. But I would say that the Chinese economy is now faced with a lot of uncertainties. One thing for sure is that the economy is slowing. And it's not going to be a cyclical slowdown. It's a structural slowdown. To understand that, if we can take a look at slide 63, please. Yeah, I think China's magic economic growth in the past few decades had a lot to do with its unique demographics. In the first 30 years since the establishment of People's Republic of China, namely the 50s, 60s, 70s, Mao Zedong encouraged very high birth rate. If a woman could produce 5 children, she would be labeled as a glorious mother, literally. But that policy was only to be replaced 30 years later by the one-child policy. So starting from the 80s, when the baby boomers start to enter the labor market, China imposed one-child policy. So the share of working-age population surged in the past 3 decades, leading to rapid economic growth because you have excess labor supply and you have excess supply of capital, extremely cheap labor and cheap capital. So you grow your economy like a crazy. But unfortunately, the Chinese population is at the verge of aging. Starting from next year, 2015, the share of working-age population will start to fall. This fall is going to be very sharp, even sharper than the 1990s Japan, because China had government intervention in the birth rate policy. So by then, I would say labor supply will shrink, and the savings rate will also decline. Both capital and labor will become more expensive, and it's more difficult to grow the economy. So structurally, you will see an economic slowdown, and it's not something that short-term policy stimulus can change. I will just stop here.
Ginny, do you have a view on this from perhaps a business perspective? I know that you do a consultancy sort of service, but you see many companies, and what is their reaction?
The reaction is that the Chinese government, if you look at the third plenum that took place in November, and then you look at what they call the Lianghui, which is in March, the National People's Congress meeting, and the CCPPCC, the Chinese
Citizens
Political Consultative.
Yeah.
The plan is to have a different kind of growth and to slow the GDP growth down. So the fact that it was 7% last year and the first quarter results are 7.4% has not really had any kind of a chill either on foreign direct investment coming into China, or the real change that I see. You're dating me going back to 1978 when I first moved to China. There were only 9 corporations empowered to do business in China. They were import-export corporations. And it was very easy to figure out how to do business in China. If it was technology, it was China National Technology Import-Export Corporation. If you were selling machinery, it was China National Machinery Import-Export Corporation. And I worked at Chase Manhattan Bank at the time, and I remember David Rockefeller, who was a fantastic boss, said to me, "Ginny, you always know the right partner in China. It's absolutely amazing. No matter who walks in here, well, you only had to memorize the names of 9 companies." And but then you fast forward and you have a situation now where the paradigm has completely changed. I never thought that I would see this in my lifetime, where in those days, 78, there was no joint venture law. You couldn't invest in China. There was no wholly foreign-owned enterprise law. So you were really restricted on what you could do. And China had no money. So business in those days was conducted on a counter-trade basis. Today, China's sitting on nearly $4 trillion in excess foreign exchange reserves. So where we've seen a lot of activity is in China's outbound investment. Initially, it was in raw materials like like iron ore and oil, strategic raw materials, and now we're in Australia, Canada, in Africa, and now we're seeing it across sectors. So I have to say that this slowdown has the clients that we've worked with, and the first 3 clients since I left Chase and started my own firm in 1980. I don't know if it's good news or bad news that they're still with us. You could do a good job, and 6 months later you move on. But they actually see this as China being rational, trying to have a different kind of growth that was referred to in the previous regime as happy growth, happy GDP growth, and more value added, a focus on the service sector and not just what they call 来料加工, which is processing agreements where it's low-end labor being used, but actually having higher end, moving up the value chain. So in answer to your question, I've not seen anybody get scared off of working with China. Actually, quite the opposite. I want to be part of their outbound investment, and then the focus on where China wants to focus.
Jing, can I ask you to look at this problem from a slightly different point of view, which is what is the political impact, whether the economy is going to take a hard landing or not?
Yeah, I think first, I don't think that most of people will think there is no hard landing or soft landing. So the bad news is that it's going to slow down, and a lot of people are going to be affected. But the good news, I want to emphasize, this slowdown is driven by policy. It's not driven by market forces. So unlike the slowdown here or slowdown in Japan, it's all driven by market forces. So economy is a slowdown, recession, even collapse. But China's slowdown is because the Chinese leaderships realize there is a problem. The investment-driven economy simply cannot go on. So therefore, the change of policy, like Ho Chi Minh said, is structural slowdown, or you said, so it's a policy slowdown. So that's the good news. And the continued good news is that because there's a policy slowdown, the Chinese leaders are ready, Chinese government are prepared for this. So therefore, there's no such kind of chaotic situation or paranoia. So another good news, we know that Chinese government has a very strong capability to intervene. They have a lot of ammunitions. So another good news is, of course, people actually benefit from this slowdown. For example, last year, for the first time in 30 years, China's service sector outdid the China's industrial manufacturing sector. So that means the employment actually improved a lot. But there are also bad news. That's why I come to political impact, because this slowdown is going to focus on 3 things. Number 1 is to break the monopoly. Number 2 is to reform the taxation structure or restructure China's taxation system. And number 3, of course, to reform the way the means of production is transferred, land, capital, and so on and so forth. So therefore, this slowdown, policy-driven slowdown reform are going to meet with very strong resistance from the vested interests. And those vested interests cause what I call iron triangle: the state-owned enterprises, local economy, and unfortunately financial sector. Those 3 sectors are going to put up very strong resistance towards the slowdown. So that will impact something, and but how far it can go and to what extent this impact can be felt by people from different walks of life, we have to wait and see.
Do you get a sense that the Chinese leadership now has the political strength to carry these things and resist the pushback from these quarters?
3 issues. Number 1, they are very united on this. The top leaders realize they have to fix this, the so-called new leadership. So even you look at Li Keqiang or Xi Jinping, or Wang Qishan, they all put together. That's very important. Second, because of that, the Chinese leadership is very competent. I have confidence in that. We know that leadership is very important for a big country like China. And last but not the least, like I said, and there is certain social support. That's why when I heard that people saying, "Oh, slowdown is going to cause some social, chaotic society in China," I don't think so, because I think there is a kind of understanding, not on the top leadership, but among the ordinary people, that it's time for China to consolidate. And to consolidate, you need to slow down a little bit.
May I invite any comments or questions from the floor before we go to another topic? Please, ma'am.
Hi, This question is for Professor Huang, actually. You mentioned that you have a lot of confidence in China's leadership's competency in controlling basically the economic and financial risk within the system. My question is, China is now the second largest economy. I mean, the challenges the leadership is facing is dramatically different from, let's say, 10 years ago. So given how complicated the economy has become, do you see this challenge for the leadership increasing in the future, number one? And number two, to lose up SOE sector, does that actually create a disincentive for the leadership I mean, if they want to be in control, I guess still the bank lending, SOE, GDP, this axis is still the best way to do it. Sorry.
Okay, I'll answer first question and a little bit second question, but I leave my colleague Hajimin to answer your second question because he knows better than I do in that one. I think leadership confidence is based on three areas. Number one, all of them start from the very bottom. All the leaders, they spend over 30 years starting from village level, township level, and each one of them has served at least in 2 provinces and 2 ministries. So they're extremely experienced. They know the system, they know how to game the system, and also they know society, that's first. And second, we know that even though China is not democracy, the way they produce the leadership extremely thorough because they have 82 million party members, every one of them want to be on top. And the last but not the least, the Chinese leaders nowadays, they do not just make a decision out of the empty heads. They have a very thorough consultation process. They're consulting not only their own scholars, experts, they're also consulting experts from outside, people like me, and also a lot of people from the United States. So it is a very thorough decision-making process. It's quite ironic. China is not democracy, but the decision-making process, I would say, quite democratic. And so, last but not the least, of course, because the benefits from non-democratic society, because it's non-democratic, so they can really centralize the power, get all the resources they need to make a decision. So if you look at the past 30 years, many times people say China is going to collapse, China is going to collapse, because the problem, like you said, the challenge is so formidable. But every time they were wrong. Why? Because China has this can-do government. Your second question about all of this, of course, they're going to meet a lot of resistance, like I said, especially state-owned enterprises. But the problem, the way they can overcome this challenge, because like number one, they have a lot of resources in their mind. Number two, they're prepared for this. Number three, let's keep in mind that China is a huge country. It's big, it's very deep. It's not like Japan, to some extent, even like United States. So therefore, this kind of depth has actually benefited the Chinese leadership, especially the leadership that determine do things and have a lot of ammunition. I just stop here.
Timing, would you like to respond to the lady's question?
Yeah, I think if you look at what happened in the past few years, on the one hand, the Chinese leadership has been talking about the need to reform, to rebalance the economy. But the thing is, when you try to correct the imbalances, you have to tolerate much slower economic growth. But the slowing growth would trigger some other problems, like a social instability, because if people get unemployed, they might take to the street. And non-performing loan problems will emerge. So when faced with a tough decision, reform for the benefit of long-term sustainable growth or short-term stability, it seems that the priority is always given to short-term stability, even it could be at the cost of long-term bigger problems over the longer run. And the good news is that the chart we just showed, the Chinese economy, government, corporates are still enjoying huge demographic dividends because the country's savings rate is still high. You can one hand ask banks take money from depositors, on the other hand, you lend to corporates to roll over so the snowball. Yeah. And if that has a monetary implication, inflation implication, some shadow banking activity will also take hold. Or if you start to control shadow banking, then local government can find land to sell. One way or another, they come up with money because the country savings rate is still high. But the thing is how long this could go. I think if the snowball is getting bigger and bigger, you can see a bigger problem and bigger risk in the future that a lot of bubbles popping at the same time. One is debt issue, the debt bubble. The other is property bubble. I mean, housing price in China is at ridiculously high prices. One needs to save from Tang Dynasty in order to buy an apartment in Shanghai. Literally, I think you can do the math. It's, yeah. And I just did a very quick calculation. I assume a typical household in Shanghai to buy just a 90 square meter apartment. It's not big, it's small, like a 900 square feet, with 30% down payment. Then the monthly mortgage exceeds the average household income in that city. That shows that the buyers are actually not the average household. They must be the top rich Chinese household or some other rich people from other parts of the country. So these people, why are they buying? Because they already bought because they're rich, right? So they're buying only for the purpose of investment, because they're buying in preparation for their retirement. Due to the one-child policy, there's no social safety net in that country, and they cannot rely on their kids to support them. Not kids, actually kid. There's no kids in China, only kid, right? So, so they are buying apartment like they're investing in their pension fund. But when they get old, after 2015, there will be more sellers as opposed to the current situation when there are more buyers. So you will have more sellers. And the purpose they bought apartment when they were young is that they want to sell them. They want to cash them out. So you're going to have huge sell pressure going forward. And that bubble or property bubble will also be pricked. Not by policy. Maybe the government does not want, no government wants to see a bubble being popped. But the market reality is you have to pop. Then we will see a quite significant challenge to the Chinese economy and to its financial system as well.
Please.
I wonder if you could address, we've read about multiple crackdowns on corruption in China, and it seems as though this is a priority of the elite. Can you talk a little bit about, is this reality, is this a political weapon, and how do you see this all working over the next several years?
I think it's both. First, it provides the current leadership a very strong weapon or leverage to get what they want to do. As I said, reform going to meet with very strong resistance. And those resistance, you can figure out, are those people who benefited in the past 30 years under the previous leadership. So therefore, if you look at anti-corruption, it's essentially targeted, you know who, Zhou Yongkang, all those people to Jiang Zemin. So that's very strong. So this gives them political weapons to get things they want to do. But on the other hand, it is also for a larger reason, because we know that the Communist Party's legitimacy usually comes from economic delivery. They deliver economic development, but we know it's going to slow down. So the resource for that kind of legitimacy is running short. So therefore, anti-corruption gives them another source of political legitimacy. So that's a larger bit. And the last but not the least is that they realize that the way the politics is run in China simply cannot last very long. So for them, it's both for political legitimacy, to get things done, to push through reform policy, and also to clean up the system. And there's some personal reason in it, which I want to emphasize here, is that if you look the children of the 4 generations of Chinese leaders, China has went through from Mao Zedong to Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, now Xi Jinping. And in Xi Jinping, in this leadership, all of them, you call them princelings. That is, those are children of the founding fathers.
The princelings.
Princelings, right? But if you compare what the children do about the 4 generation leaders, you can see a big difference. If you look at children of first generation and second generation, to some extent, they do 3 jobs. They either join the army, become a generals, or they do science studies, become scientists, or they join the government, become government officials. But if you look at children of a 3rd generation and the fourth generation, the children of Jiang Zemin, Xi Jinping, or Hu Jintao, every one of them is a CEO. That tells you the difference between two generations of children. And for Xi Jinping, of course, he's a children of first generation. For him, there's a personal feeling that this kind of system, the regime, the country, the state, whatever you call it, founded by the fathers, being stolen by the management. So they want to get it back. So it's also personal drive. So that's why this anti-corruption campaign is for real. And I believe it will produce positive thing for China. What I worry now is that they move too fast, not too slow.
Can I just add to that?
Yeah.
I don't know if you all heard Hank Paulson speak yesterday, but he, quite self-effacing, he didn't talk about the strategic and economic dialogue, which he established when he was Secretary of the Treasury. His counterpart was Vice Premier Wang Qishan, who was economic czar of China for trade and investment. Wang Qishan now is in charge of this anti-corruption campaign. Yeah. So they have taken someone who is highly experienced in trade and investment and the outside world, and put him in charge of this campaign. He must have a lot of pressure and a lot of headaches because it's a lot of work. And I agree that it should not go, it needs to be done. How long it will take, I think, to be realistic is looking at somewhere between 5 and 10 years, more like 10 years. I don't know if my panelists would agree with me.
Yeah, 5 years.
5 years.
It's a long job.
Well, so you're more optimistic that
No,
you can do it quickly.
Because the thing they wanted to reform essentially is a redistribution of power, benefits, and resources. And that kind of job always will create a lot of difficulties. Yeah. So I always say slow down, get it done slowly, better than get it not done fastly. So that's why.
There was a question, excuse me, someone before you. There was a question on the side. Yes, please.
You know, one of the things you had mentioned earlier were the demographics that were in the favor of China for its tremendous growth. You know, a second part of that equation was the tremendous amount of fixed investment, capital investment in infrastructure, urbanization in China. As China transitions from an economy driven by investment to one geared towards consumption, what do you see as the greatest challenges in moving in that transition?
Okay, yeah, that's a very good question. Can we have page 64? I was about to address that issue, actually. Now, as a consequence of demographics and also policies, China's economy is now highly distorted. One measure of that is the investment to GDP ratio. This variable has surged to over 50%. What is 50%? Well, if you look at Japan and Korea, two countries that used to have very high savings rate, high investment rate, their peak was only 40%. In Japan, it was in the early 70s, and for Korea, it was in the early 90s. But China is now over 50%. And what is more amazing is that in the past year, this ratio increased from 48% in 2012 to over 50% last year. And if you compare this with China's own history, the previous peak was around 42% in 1958 during the Great Leap Forward, which was followed by 3 years of economic disaster and famine. People were starving in the early 60s as a result of the excessive expansion in the late 50s. And the other side of the coin is, you can see the ratio of consumption to GDP is as low as 33%, as compared to 70 or 80% in the US. Even if you compare that to the other emerging market economy, it was around 60%. That's the normal level. But in China, this is the huge distortion. And this imbalance needs to be corrected. How to correct it? One way of doing that is to promote consumption. But unfortunately, consumption cannot be promoted overnight. because the country doesn't even have a social safety net. People have always have these kind of precautions, concerns, and they save. And housing prices so high, they are putting aside down payment, but only to be found that it's not enough because housing prices increase even faster. So people save, they don't consume. And then you have to slow investment growth. But that will inevitably lead to much slower economic growth. So last year I did a simulation and put out a report entitled, Goodbye 8%, Welcome 6%. Meaning China will have to say goodbye to 8% forever probably. And what is going to happen is in the foreseeable future, 6% is more desirable. If you still want to do 7 or 7.5%, sorry, this imbalance problem will further deteriorate until the snowball becomes unsustainably large.
The lady here.
Yeah, the one-child policy. Oh, sorry.
Yes.
The one-child policy. Is there going to be a relaxation of that, as rumored, and what are the implications? And the second thing is, my understanding was there was also a one-condo policy. So I don't think that people are speculating in buying more than one home as a savings vehicle. That's my understanding, and that's why there is so much condo buying in Australia and Canada.
Okay, that's a good question. Yeah, one-child policy, relaxation of one-child policy is not a rumor. It's true.
It's
in some cities, it's already being implemented. The thing is, you cannot change the demographics because you cannot give birth to a 20-year-old. You have to wait for 2 decades to see the outcome. That's very unfortunate. So demographic mistakes, don't make demographic mistakes. If you do, then you're going to wait for a long time to correct it. And another thing is, if you allow people to have second child, many families will opt not to because they cannot even take care of one child due to the rising housing prices, lack of social security. And the cost of living is on the rise as well. So people are not going to use that policy. So I would not bet too much on that. And this one condo policy was used exactly because so many people, the economy was enjoying rising labor force, and these rising labor force are buying property. So there was a need to control property price. But still, there are so many families in China own multiple homes because the restriction was just imposed a couple of years ago. So as a result, you are seeing now, first, after 2015, the elderly will start to sell the apartment. Secondly, there's an anti-corruption measure that would help control the registration of apartment. So some government officials, they better do something before they got caught, right? So there are different forces of selling, and that will probably lead to a softening in housing prices and even collapse housing prices in some 3rd or 4th tier cities.
Just very quickly, and some pundits, experts argue that China's demographic dividend is run out, so China is going to become old before it's become rich. Just look at Japan. I think that's a misleading argument, largely because Chinese societies remain open society, just like Europe and Singapore. So if you remain open society, people from other parts of the world will always come in. For example, 10 years, it is almost imaginable that Chinese will marry a Vietnamese girl or Cambodian girl, but now the girl from Vietnamese, Cambodian come in very fast. So as a result, I think if you look at China, China is an open society. So as long as China remains open, there will be immigration come in. But I really worry about is what you call one condo policy, because now China tried to use one condo policy to squeeze out speculations. But there is some negative part of that, because now the one condo policy, but if they let it go, people will rush in. And that, just like Ha Jimin said, instead of squeeze a bubble out, it will create a bigger bubble. After all, in other words, the people who are buying condo in China, overall it's declining, it's not going up.
Ginny, you have something to add?
Sure. On the one-child policy, there are implications of a huge magnitude that I don't think we've really come to grips with. And one of them being that there are many more boys than girls. They refer to the Xiao Huangdi, the Little Emperor syndrome, having mostly, if you're going to only have one child, then it should be a boy as opposed to a girl. So that's one issue. You also, I totally agree with the change in the policy. Will it actually be implemented? Because if you live in China, socially right now, it's been so many years that it's only been acceptable to have one child, and it is the mindset of people in China to have one child. And there's always been pressure if one had more than one child, you'd have to hide the second child. But I think it goes beyond that. I think it's just become socially acceptable and the way it is, even though the policy has changed. And there was a slow attempt to change this. And first it was if both the husband and wife were from only families,
one child
families, then you could have a second child. But that's been relaxed. Before that, it was if you were a Shaoshuminzi, which is a minority, you could have multiple children. But as a result, you're going to see problems that I don't think China ever thought about, the world thought about, in terms of having enough wives, for one thing. But there are also opportunities. I think if there's slide 21, I was just looking, and this was put together by Milken, and it shows healthcare and investment on venture capitalists and PE firms. You're going to have opportunities in terms of how are you going to deal with that elderly, your elderly parents. I have friends now that they have their own child, and it's just the two of them supporting 4 parents. Very difficult situations. So a proliferation of housing for the elderly. We're seeing a lot of movement in this area and in the private sector, actually.
I just want to jump to another topic. I'm sure many of you have seen last week's cover of The Economist, which is about cities in China and development of cities. The picture itself is quite alarming because of the terrible pollution of this particular Chinese city. Well, clean air, clean food, clean water. I guess that would be the most minimum that a population can expect from a responsible government. Now, how is the Chinese government addressing these issues of clean air, clean water, and clean food, which actually affects the daily lives of their people on a daily basis? How are they addressing it? Jing, you want to address this first?
I think first and foremost that the Chinese leaders realize a crisis is coming. And for them, it's not just an environmental issue, it's a political and social issue. If we go look at a very quick review of history, all the political revolution in modern times, in Japan, in Taiwan, in South Korea, actually started with the environmental issue, not economic issues. Japan in 1980s, Taiwan also 1980s, Korea about late 1980s. But if you look at Western Europe, it's also started with, because environmental issue affect everybody's life, put people united together with, a political movement. You have to have a target, and what can be better target, better goal for environmental issue. So Chinese leaders realize that. But the problem is how to get from point A to point B. They face 2 fronts. The first front, of course, international front. They're trying to fight the North about pollution because they think that's not fair for China as a developing country to shoulder all those kind of load on environmental issue. But now they're giving up on that front because to them, it is not about others, it's about Chinese themselves. So therefore, they're facing the domestic front. The domestic front is facing 3 forces, all of them against this. Number one is the local government. They still want fast development. Like Ho Chi Minh said, one negative impact of investment-driven economy is that it will create environmental issue, because the investment economy focus on investment on the infrastructure, manufacture, and other kind of quick, fast money making sense. So that will create environmental issue. So therefore, they face the first recession from local economy. Second, of course, they face all those people who still want to make a quick buck, and they're root into Chinese society. Last but not the least, of course, they're facing, if they change it too fast, the economy will slow down so badly, then will be an issue. But the good news is that if you look at China now, they have the fastest growth of the renewable energy industry, either on water, on wind, liquid gas, or solar. And second, China began to work out a very tough environmental law. And last but not the least, there is the increasing public awareness that if you don't do this, they're going to kill themselves. So they have a very strong social support on that part, which also gives them more kind of tolerance on this. So I would argue that China's environmental issue, China's environmental problem will get worse before it gets better. So worst time is the next 5 years, because it takes time. But so if Chinese leaders can manage those 5 years about environmental issues, then they're going to survive. So therefore, they have priorities. Their priorities, of course, they're going to fix first, number one, on those most polluted industries, number two, on the metropolitan area, like Beijing, Shanghai, because that's where population is. And number three, of course, on energy security, try to switch more and more energy supply to the clean energy, and rather than depending on the coal.
I was going to say this slide, and you saw it on 28, reminded me of how I was sold a bill of goods when I bought my office in Beijing. And I actually bought the office in 1997, and it was sold to me it's not far from the Forbidden City in Tiananmen Square. And they said, look, you can see the Forbidden City, you can see Tiananmen Square, you can see Xiangshan, which are the Western Hills. And frankly, that's better than to the right than it normally is now. And within the last, I hate to tell you, in the last month, I've had to close my office twice because the air quality was too dangerous for people to go outside. And there have been days where I have a 16-year-old son, and when he was little and growing up in Beijing, the children couldn't play outside. So it was, we're not going to be outdoors today, you need to be indoors today. This is not tolerable. But one of the points that Huang Jing made, which is a concern about chaos and not tolerating chaos in China, something like this, I think is one of the biggest problems that the Chinese leadership faces, because if this gets too out of hand, will you have a serious problem among the masses? So I think it's an immediate issue that needs to be addressed. And on pollution, you're right, it's not only air, it's water, it's quality of water. The Chinese themselves have come out with a statistic on quality of water, which they say that 60% of the areas that they monitor are not acceptable quality. But it's not only quality, it's also quantity. China has 20% of the world's population and only 7% fresh water. 30% of China is actually considered to be desert. So think about the size of the population of China, and if you superimpose a map of the United States on China, you have essentially close to the same land mass. But think of the United States as 30% desert, and several-fold the population. So that's a real problem. And then the third area, and I think about that under the issue of population, is food safety. Because if you have soil, that's a problem. Then you have food problems. And we've seen that with tainted milk. And people that are having babies in China today are importing infant formula, even though it's made in China and some by Western firms that are 100% foreign owned. They still will have people hand carry infant formula into China.
The United States is a very, very lucky land. because you have two coasts. The moment you have two coasts, it changes the weather pattern. Secondly, you have this great river running right through the middle of the United States, which should have been desert, but it isn't, because you have the Great Mississippi and the other river systems. And that's why the arable land in the US is so much more than China. And China is very short of water. The Chinese government has tried to have a scheme calling moving the water from the south to the north, because the northern areas are the driest of the areas. But this is a massive changing of channeling water to the north, and I don't think it is, the results have come out yet. It's a very, very big and a very difficult thing to do. But these are very serious issues, and if you have any questions on this, I think you could have the panel, please.
Well, it's kind of related. I'm sorry. Just a couple of the topics that you touched on today. There's a lot of people from China who are now buying property here in California. They're coming to LA to get away from the smog, for one reason. And just wondering, as China's economy slows down, as their property bubble bursts, what are the implications for their buying over here and Chinese bringing capital to the United States?
Jimmy, I think we can use this occasion to also talk about not investments into China, but China moving overseas as they invest, and not just in property, because they are looking at industries, they're buying into commercial properties, they're investing outside. Many, for example, a Chinese firm I know in Shanghai is now the largest shareholder of Club Med. And Club Med wants them to buy it because it will bring Club Med into China, into a very big market. So maybe, Jimmy, we can address that, but also from that point of view.
It's a very interesting question. Actually, I, in Goldman Sachs, works on the asset management side. I have a lot of high net worth individuals, clients in China. Now, I feel increasingly over the past couple of years, many of my clients were asking questions like, should I buy apartment in San Francisco, in New York, in London, in Sydney? First, of course, they want to diversify. They got too many assets onshore in China. Seeing that asset prices are not rising as fast as in the past, in some cases even falling, they want to diversify. More recently, the renminbi exchange rate stopped appreciating, and actually it depreciated quite significantly in the recent months. So this is another trigger for these people, high net worth individuals, thinking about diversifying their assets. But China still has capital control, right? And the current account is open, but the capital account is not fully open. So they need to do this through some creative ways. So, of course, that's why you see China's export data are so strange compared to other countries. In the past few months, when other countries' exports were slowing, China's exports were still growing. Well, that's because a lot of people over-invoice their export proceeds. They export goods with such a little value, but they claim that it's huge, so that they can park some money outside. So that's the thing, and you get the money around the world to preserve the value. Whether they are coming to the U.S. or Europe or Australia, I think a lot of Chinese, rich Chinese, already invested quite extensively in Canada, the U.S. Some years ago, but now they start to see opportunities in Europe, because some European countries even have this immigration door open to those who can afford to buy property there. And also for tax purpose, tax reasons, many rich Chinese feel that if they come to the U.S., maybe there's some complication with tax. They don't understand the system. So they want to look at opportunities around the world. So Europe becomes a very hot spot now. Yeah.
Would you like to add anything?
No, that's it.
I just was looking at statistics for the first quarter of this year, and it's the first time that Chinese investment in the United States has exceeded U.S. investment in China. And in answer to this gentleman's question, we're seeing it certainly in terms of real estate. But I also agree with Jiming. Companies like HNA, Hainan Airlines, has bought the NH Group, which is a hotel chain in Spain. I've seen interest throughout Europe, in Paris, because there's this focus on tourism and consumption, and that despite issues with France and the political system in France, you're still going to have tourists that want to see the Louvre and going to Paris. So I don't think that it's happened quite yet, but I think we will start to see quite a bit of, well, it has started, but I think there's going to be increased investment in Europe. And I also think that the U.S. has gotten better. China used to sort of take a pass, if you want. Maybe that's too strong a comment, but the U.S. made it difficult. The CFIUS, which is a government hurdle that the Chinese had to go through in Washington, had gotten in the way and blocked several transactions. That has changed. The largest investment was Shuanghui, which was pork, buying Smithfield in Virginia, I guess, Virginia hams, right? And now, I guess as of yesterday, the head of Disney now surpasses the Smithfield.
That's right.
In terms of investment the other way. But we are seeing the pretty sizable investments now. That did pass CFIUS. Some people were hesitant and said, CFIUS won't prove that. But I think the U.S. has relaxed, gotten more realistic, and that the investment from China is now more welcome than we've seen in the past.
But if there's a property bubble in China, is there a risk that could create a property, or is creating a property bubble here?
I don't think it's going to be so significant because, China is still a low-income country on per capita GDP basis. Right? It's only the top rich Chinese who can afford to buy abroad, and they come here and they know that the property prices in the U.S. have already increased in the past few years. But if you compare with China, it's still a lot cheaper. For example, in Washington, D.C. area, I know you can buy a 5-bedroom apartment with $2 million US, with half or even 1 acre of land. So that's a capital city. But a similar size of apartment house in China, in Beijing, could cost you 5 times as much. And they don't have 1 acre of land. So, and in the past, many Chinese wealthy individuals didn't know. They said, well, China doesn't have property tax. The U.S. has property tax. But actually, when you buy an apartment in the U.S. in a good school district, you send your kids to public school and it's free. They didn't know that. But in China, they're sending their kids to international school, like American school. They're paying tuition that's way higher than the property tax here. So now people start to realize, whoops, you can in the U.S. have 5 children, right? You don't have to just have 1 child, and you can actually save money. To answer your question, yes, they will continue to come here, and they will continue to go to London and Europe. Yes.
I would say that it's the opposite. First about the property bubble in China. Yes, there is, but it's how they being squeezed out. But if I have a one-line answer to your question, I would say that it is exactly because it's a fear that China is going to have a bubble, drives more Chinese to come here to buy the property. So it's a good news for guys here.
Yes, please.
Hi, I have a quick question about the profile of the everyman Chinese investor. Now, I know that there's a lot of policy change to kind of change the ideology and the strategy and the understanding of the everyman investor into the economy? For example, taxation treatment on dividend income is being affected. What other policy changes are they implementing currently to kind of, for the maturation of the Chinese investor, for example, that the understanding of the markets? What else is going to happen in the next few years?
You want to give it? Taxation, yeah. In China, tax relies on indirect taxes rather than direct taxes. Whereas in many developed countries, like in the US, it relies on direct tax, individual income tax, corporate income tax. But in China, I mean, the richest or the poorest are not paying, income tax. It's only people working in the formal sector. Right? So it's mainly coming from indirect taxes like a VAT, transaction taxes. But the thing is, these kind of taxes are regressive taxes, meaning the rich are taxed very light and the poor people are taxed more. And it is actually punishing consumption, which is not good, because China needs consumption growth to correct the imbalances. But the reality in China is the tax administration capacity does not allow the switch from indirect tax to direct taxes. So as a result, you will see some just piecemeal changes to the tax code. Sometimes they increase the amount for deduction. Sometimes they would also impose more taxes on property transaction, for example. But the reality is, because the income tax and particularly corporate income tax is now slowing due to the economic slowdown. So the tax in percent of GDP in China is now growing only single digit. In the past few years, it was like 20 to 30% growth a year. Now only single digits. Then the government tried to, in order to support economic growth, try to think about other channels to get financing, bank financing, or informal banking financing. These are being used for years. Now, the debt level is rising. So the government is now thinking about involving or inviting private sector to invest in public projects to create some kind of a hybrid of ownership. But the problem is China is not in the 70s. In the 70s, because the economy is in shortage of many goods. So in private sector, they know when they invest, definitely there's strong demand because there's an excess demand. But nowadays, you go to China, there's excess supply everywhere. So you invest, probably you don't have a good return. Why private sector would do it? Only government would do it. But government is now constrained by tax, constrained by other financing regulations. They cannot do it. So I think what we are going to see is a persistent slowdown in economic growth.
We have time for just one last question because our time is up. Could we give the mic to the gentleman in front?
Yes, I've got a couple of questions. The first one is into food security. What is China doing for the food security? And the other question is related to the shale and oil development in China. We've seen the revolution started in the U.S., but China yet to actually react into provided. I mean, despite the fact that China's reserve into oil and gas, shale oil and gas is way far from U.S. Thank you.
Okay. On the shale and gas, if you're in the field, you know that it is not how much you have on the ground, it's how you get it out. Now, commercially speaking, it still does not make sense even in the United States, because it costs a lot more to get them out, given the market price right now. But US is leading the revolution, so China is watching carefully. China needs, because shale gas you get out, you need a huge capital. It's very capital intensive, and then you need technology. China has capital, but China is not sure has the technology first. And so shale and gas, I think the momentum is created here, but how to carry across the Pacific, we have to wait and see. And that's on shale. And second, on your first question is on food security. Yeah. The problem for China is that 20% of land being polluted. So a lot of food security, because food has grown from the land. So it's a massive problem. And the water, 70% of water, surface water in China is not drinkable. So that's massive. And last but not the least is the regulations. Yes, they're very strict regulations, but to what extent that regulations, the laws will be followed is still a problem. So China has all the three problems in combined. Number one, if you remind, in the 19th century in the United States, we also have a lot of people create fake food. That is very massive in China. That's one problem. Second, regulations. United States pollution is not under control until about 50 years ago when the regulations really get in gear, and that is in China. And the last, not least, is how the government penetrate in this issue. And China's penetrating, political penetration is very deep, but the food pollution, there's a lot of layers of resistance. So you have a three combination of all the problems is huge. So I would argue that, like before, I think environmental issue will become more and more explosive issue in China.
Investment outside China itself.
I was going to, if I can comment on that, that's where the paradigm has switched. And you have a sovereign wealth fund, for example, buying land in Kazakhstan to grow soybeans.
Exactly.
Right? You have Shuanghui buying Smithfield as another example, also so that you can try to have fully integrated hog farms and learn from that. So I think we're going to see China sort of expanding its borders. And I don't mean that from a security perspective, but I mean it from a food security perspective, that they have to do that, and they are doing that.
Thank you very much. We have run out of time, and I thank you very much for your attention, and have a good meeting later this afternoon. Thank you.